There are things about land that no document can ever fully capture. The way certain floorboards remember the weight of every foot that ever crossed them, the way a stone foundation holds 3 generations of breath inside its mortar, the way the dust on a grist mill floor settles only over the parts of the building that have stopped working, leaving the rest visible and quietly alive. My grandfather understood this. My grandmother understood it. My sister and I were the only 2 people in the family who had been taught to listen for it, which is why, when our uncle gathered everyone in the lawyer's office in Carter County, Tennessee, and announced with the satisfied calm of a man delivering an obvious verdict that the rotting grist mill on the back acre was the only piece of the family farm roof and I would inherit, I didn't argue. I didn't ask questions. I didn't demand to see the one my grandfather had supposedly signed 3 weeks before he died, the one our uncle's attorney had produced with flourish, the one that handed the 420 acres of bottomland, the cattle, the equipment shed, the original 1887 farmhouse, and the entire mineral lease portfolio to Uncle Calvin and his 3 sons. I sat there in my work jeans with my sister beside me in her nurse's scrubs because she had driven straight from a 12-hour shift in Knoxville to make the meeting, and I let our uncle finish his speech about how the mill was a sentimental gesture, a recognition, he said, of how often Ruth and I had played in it as children. The way he said the word sentimental was a small private cruelty. He meant worthless. Everyone in the room understood him. Our cousins laughed openly. Calvin's wife Marlene smiled the way she had smiled at us for 30 years, as though our presence at any family gathering was a slightly embarrassing oversight that someone would eventually correct. I thanked the attorney politely. Ruth shook his hand. We walked out into the Tennessee October light, and we drove the 11 miles back to farm in complete silence. Not because we had nothing to say, but because what we had to say was not for the truck cab. It was for the mill itself. Before we go any further, subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're listening from. This story takes place in the hill country of East Tennessee, where the land remembers things, and the people who work it longest are the ones who remember the most. If what you're about to hear feels familiar, you're not alone. Stay with us. My name is Eli Hatcher. I'm 58 years old. My sister Ruth is 55. We grew up on a farm our great-grandfather Joseph Hatcher established in 1887 on a long sloping piece of bottomland along the Nolichucky River, where the soil is the color of dark coffee grounds, and the corn grows so tall in August that a child walking through it can disappear in 3 steps. The grist mill, a 3-story structure of hand-cut limestone and rough-hewn chestnut timber, built directly over the mill race that fed off Beaver Creek, where it joined the river, was the second thing Joseph built on the property. The first was a small clapper house where he and my great-grandmother lived for the first 11 years of their marriage before they had saved enough to construct the larger farmhouse that Calvin now owned outright. The mill ground corn, wheat, and buckwheat for every far within 20 miles of our holler from 1889 until 1971, when my grandfather Hollis quietly closed it down because a regional cooperative in Greenville had finally driven the last of the small custom millers out of business. The millstones, 2 enormous burrs of French quartzite that Joseph had imported through the port of Charleston in 1888, went still for the first time in 82 years and stayed still for the next 53. I was the one who stayed. Ruth left for nursing school when she was 19 and never moved back full-time, though she came home most weekends through the years our parents were dying. I went to the agricultural college in Knoxville for 2 years, came home in 1986 when our father had his first heart attack, and never left again. I took over the cattle operation when our father couldn't manage it anymore. I planted the bottomland corn every spring and harvested it every fall. I rebuilt the equipment shed in 1994 after a windstorm took the roof off. I dug new drainage along the south fence line in 2003 when the spring thaws kept washing out the lower pasture. I sat with our mother through the last 6 months of her cancer in 2008 in the upstairs bedroom of the farmhouse where she had been born. I sat with our father through the last 3 weeks of his in 2011 in the same room, and after they were gone, I stayed on at the farmhouse with our grandfather Hollis, who was 91 by then, and refused absolutely to consider any living arrangement that did not involve dying in the same bedroom his daughter had died in. I cooked for him. I drove him to his appointments. I read aloud to him in the evenings from the agricultural journals he had subscribed to for 60 years and could no longer focus his eyes on properly. And I listened to the things he told me about the farm, the small, persistent lessons he had been delivering in pieces since I was old enough to walk a row of corn beside him. He talked about the mill more than anything else. He would sit in his chair by the kitchen window with a cup of coffee gone cold in his hand and tell me, sometimes for the third or fourth time in a single week, about the day his father Joseph had walked him down to the mill race when he was 7 years old and shown him how the water entered the flume, about the particular sound the upper burr made when the gap between the stones was set correctly, a sound he described as a low, even hum, like a hive of bees that had just been told good news, about the way the dust from the milling drifted through the slats of the second-floor windows in the late afternoon light and made the entire interior of the mill look like the inside of a lantern. He told me about the floor. He told me about the floor more times than I can count. The floor of that mill, he would say, his pale blue eyes finding mine across the kitchen, is older than anything else on this property, Eli. Older than the farmhouse. Older than the equipment shed. Older even than the foundation under the spring house. My father laid those boards himself with timber he cut from a stand of chestnut on a ridge above Beaver Creek the winter of 1888, before the blight took every chestnut in this country. There is no like that wood anywhere in Tennessee anymore. There is no like that wood anywhere in the world. He died in February of last year. He was 96. I found him in his chair by the kitchen window with the agricultural journal open on his lap, to an article about no-till corn rotation and an expression on his face complete and unhurried peace, as though he had finally finished a conversation that had been going on for a very long time. The funeral was at the Beaver Creek Baptist Church, where 4 generations of Hatchers were buried. Calvin gave the eulogy. Calvin had not visited the farmhouse more than 3 times in the last decade. Calvin spoke at length about the family legacy and the bonds that tie us to the land, and not one word, he said, had any specific memory of our grandfather inside it. Ruth and I sat in the second pew, because Calvin's family had taken the first. Our cousin Travis, Calvin's middle son, 41 years old, a real estate attorney in Johnson City, came up to me at the reception in the church basement and put his hand on my shoulder with the practiced warmth of a man who had been rehearsing the gesture and said, "We're going to take care of everything, Eli. You don't have to worry about a thing." I should have understood him then. I think part of me did. But understanding and accepting are different things, and I had spent 38 years on that farm believing, quietly, stupidly, the way good people often believe stupid things, that working a piece of land for nearly 4 decades and caring for the man who owned it through his last 5 years would mean something legally when the time came. It meant nothing. That is what I learned in the lawyer's office 3 weeks later. The will Calvin produced was dated January 14th of last year, 3 weeks before our grandfather died. It was witnessed by 2 people Ruth and I had never heard of, signed with a signature that looked like our grandfather's signature, the way a photograph of a man looks like the man, and it disposed of everything. The 420 acres, the 1887 farmhouse, and all its contents, the cattle, the equipment, the mineral rights to the back ridge that our grandfather had quietly held since 1962, when a small natural gas company had approached him about leasing the ridge top, and he had refused them, saying he didn't believe in selling the bones of the place. Calvin received all of it. His 3 sons, Travis, Brent, and the youngest, Cody, received specific shares of the cattle operation and the equipment, structured through a family LLC their attorney had apparently set up the previous year. Marlene received the contents of the farmhouse, which included our grandmother's handmade quilts, our mother's wedding china, and 3 generations of Hatcher family photographs. Ruth and I received the grist mill on the back acre and the half acre of overgrown ground it sat on, valued by the attorney at $4,200 as a structurally compromised historic property of limited commercial application. I sat there in my work boots and listened to Calvin's attorney read those words. Structurally compromised. Limited commercial application. I looked across the table at Calvin, who had pulled his shoulders back the way he did when he wanted to fill room, and at Travis, who was watching me with the careful neutrality of a man waiting for a counterparty to either accept the offer or expose himself by refusing it. And I thought about my grandfather sitting in the kitchen the previous fall, his hand on my forearm, telling me, for what must have been the 40th time, that the floor of that mill was older than anything else on the property, that it was made of chestnut from the ridge above Beaver Creek, that there was no wood like that wood anywhere in the world anymore. He had not been telling me about wood. He had been telling me where to look. But Calvin didn't know that, and Travis didn't know that, and Marlene didn't know that, and the three cousins watching me across the polished table didn't know that. They saw what they'd been trained to see whenever they looked at me, a slow farmer in a denim work shirt who had wasted his life on a piece of dirt while smarter people went on to do real things in real cities. And so when I nodded and said, "Thank you," and reached across the table to take the manila envelope containing the deed to a worthless mill on a half-acre of overgrown ground, what they saw was a defeated man finally accepting his place. They saw it because that is what they had always wanted to see. And, as my grandfather had told me more than once in the last year of his life, the most useful thing a hatcher can do when he is being underestimated is let the underestimation finish what it started. So I let it finish. I signed the paperwork. I shook Calvin's hand. I shook Travis's hand. I walked Ruth out of the law office and across the courthouse, square in the cold October sunlight, and I drove her back to the farm. And on the way, at a four-way stop on Highway 107, with no other cars in sight in any direction, she finally turned to me and said, very quietly, "Eli, what is going on?" I told her on the drive. I told her about the things our grandfather had said in the last year, about the floor, about the chestnut, about the way he had repeated certain phrases until they were almost ritual, older than the farmhouse, older than the equipment shed, older even than the foundation under the spring house, about the way he had asked me 2 weeks before he died whether I still had the small brass key he had given me when I was 12 years old. The one I had assumed for 46 years was a sentimental object, a child's gift from a grandfather who had wanted to make me feel important. I told her how I had answered yes, and how he had nodded slowly and said, "Good. Don't lose it. There's going to come a time, Eli." Ruth listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for almost a mile. Then she said, "He told me something, too, the last time I came home before he died. I didn't know what to make of it. He said the spring house was the most important building on the property, and that the mill was the second most important, and that Calvin would never understand either one, because Calvin had never carried water or ground corn in his life. I thought he was just being old. I thought he was confused." "He wasn't confused," I said. "No," Ruth agreed quietly. "I don't think he was." We pulled into the farm lane. The gate that had been ours that morning was now Calvin's. The farmhouse our grandmother had filled with her quilts was now Calvin's. The pasture I had drained in 2003 was now Calvin's. The equipment shed I had re-roofed in 1994 was now Calvin's. We drove past all of it in the cold afternoon light, and we kept driving, past the house, past the equipment shed, past the cattle gate, down the long rutted track that led to the back acre where the grist mill sat in the shadow of the ridge, half hidden by 20 years of unmown black walnut saplings and wild rose, and looking, to anyone who didn't know what they were looking at, exactly as worthless as Calvin's attorney had said it was. I parked the truck. Ruth and I got out. We stood for a long moment in the silence at the edge of the overgrowth, listening to Beaver Creek run its quiet line behind the building, and I felt, for the first time since the lawyer's office that morning, something settle in my chest that I recognized, after a moment, as the absence of fear. Calvin had taken everything he could see. He had taken everything he'd been raised to value: the house, the acreage, the mineral rights, the visible markers of being a hatcher who had inherited a hatcher farm. And in doing so, he had handed Ruth and me, with the satisfied confidence of a man who knew exactly what he was doing, the one thing on the entire 420 acres that our grandfather had spent the last 2 years of his life quietly making sure we would receive. I reached into my jacket pocket and felt for the small brass key. It was still there. It had been on the same ring as my truck keys for 46 years. I had carried it through 2 careers, 1 marriage, 1 divorce, the deaths of both my parents, and the slow, long death of my grandfather. I had never once asked what it was for. I had just kept it the way he had told me to keep it, because he had asked me to. "Ruth," I said, "I think we'd better go inside." The mill door was locked. It had been locked for 53 years. The padlock on the outside was a heavy old Yale that Calvin had walked past 1,000 times and never bothered to investigate, because Calvin had grown up understanding the mill as a derelict outbuilding. And a derelict outbuilding doesn't need a working lock. But the lock was working. I had checked it myself the previous summer, at our grandfather's quiet request. I had oiled the mechanism in October on his instructions. I had not asked him why. I pulled the brass key from my pocket. I fitted it to the padlock. It turned without resistance. "Oh, Eli," Ruth said softly behind me. I pushed the heavy chestnut door open. The hinges had been oiled too. The door swung inward without sound, and the late afternoon Tennessee light came through the door behind us and fell across the dusty interior of the mill in a long honey-colored bar. And what it lit up on the floor, 10 feet inside the doorway, was a single board that had clearly, unmistakably, been pried up and replaced more recently than the boards around it. The grain was the same chestnut. The age was the same. But the seam where it had been refitted was newer than 53 years old. The seam where it had been refitted was less than a year old. My grandfather had been 95 years old when he made that seam. He had done it alone. He had done it with the intention that we would find it. And whatever was under that board was the real reason Calvin had grown up to understand this mill as a worthless ruin, and the real reason our grandfather had spent 2 years preparing me to know better. Ruth and I stood in the doorway in the falling light, and we did not say anything for a long time. Then I stepped inside and Ruth followed, and I knelt down on the chestnut floor that my great-grandfather Joseph had laid in the winter of 1888, and I put my hand on the board our grandfather had left for us, and I felt clear and certain and absolutely undeniable that the second half of our inheritance was waiting underneath. I went out to the truck and got the small crowbar I always kept behind the seat. Ruth held the flashlight on her phone steady over the seam while I worked the pry end of the bar gently into the gap our grandfather had left and lifted. And the board came up cleanly, the way a board comes up when a careful man had prepared it to be lifted by someone else, with a nail set just deep enough to hold and just shallow enough to release. There was a single cavity beneath it, perhaps 14 inches deep, framed neatly with new pine on 3 sides where our grandfather had cut into the original subfloor. Inside the cavity, wrapped in heavy oilcloth and tied with the kind of rough twine our grandfather had always kept on a hook in the equipment shed, was a metal lockbox. On top of the lockbox, tucked under the twine, was a folded sheet of yellow legal paper, and on the paper, in our grandfather's slow, careful hand, was my name. "Eli." I lifted the box out. Ruth knelt beside me. The mill was very quiet around us. Beaver Creek ran its low, even line behind the back wall, and somewhere up the holler a hawk gave its single high cry, and the autumn light to the open door began to slant toward gold. I unfolded the paper. "Eli and Ruth," it began. "If you are reading this, my brother's son has done what I expected him to do, and you have done what I asked you to do, and the two halves of the story have finally come together. I am sorry I had to ask you to wait. I am sorry I had to leave you sitting in that lawyer's office with Calvin smiling at you the way he has been smiling at the two of you since you were children. I knew he would do it. I have known he would do it for 30 years. The will he produced is not mine. The signature on it is not mine. The witnesses on it are 2 men from his church in Johnson City who never met me. Calvin has had that document drafted and waiting since 2019. When his lawyer first told him that the safest moment to substitute a forge was a period immediately following an old man's death, when no one is examining anything carefully and the family is too tired to ask questions. I let him think he had succeeded. I needed him to think he had succeeded. The reasons are inside this box. Read them in order. Trust the order. Hollis Hatcher. Ruth made a small sound beside me. Not a sob, more like an exhale that had been held for a long time. She put her hand on my back. The box was not locked. I lifted the lid. The first thing inside was a letter from a law firm in Nashville called Pickering, Mosley & Vance, dated September the previous year, addressed to our grandfather and confirming receipt of the original last will and testament of Hollis Joseph Hatcher, executed before 2 attesting witnesses on the date noted herein, sealed and held in trust pending instructions. The date noted on the document was August 19th, 2002, 22 years before our grandfather's death. 22 years, 2 months, and 13 days before Calvin's forge would have been dated. Our grandfather had executed his real will in the year I came home permanently to take over the cattle operation. He had executed it within 90 days of our father's first heart attack. He had been 74 years old. He had known then, with the clarity of a man who had spent his whole life observing what people do when there is land at stake, what was going to happen when he died. And he had spent 22 years preparing for it. The second item in the box was a copy of that real will. I read through it slowly, and Ruth read over my shoulder, and the structure of it, the careful, patient legal architecture of it, was something I would not have believed our grandfather capable of constructing on his own, except that I have been listening to him talk for 20 years about the difference between the visible value of a piece of land and the actual value, and I understood, sitting on the dusty chestnut floor of his father's mill, that he had been telling me how to read this document for 2 decades before he asked me to read it. The will did 3 things. First, it acknowledged Calvin's expected forgery in advance, with a notarized affidavit from our grandfather attached, asserting under oath that any will purporting to dispose of the estate that did not match the executed copy held in trust by Pickering, Mosley and Vance was a fraudulent instrument and should be challenged on those grounds. Second, it established a structured trust, the Hatcher Family Land Preservation Trust, formed in 2003, into which our grandfather had quietly transferred legal title to the 420 acres, the mineral rights, and the original 1887 farmhouse over a 15-year period of small annual transfers structured to avoid both gift tax thresholds and family attention. The trust beneficiaries were Ruth and me. The trust trustees were 2 attorneys at Pickering, Mosley, and Vance, neither of whom had ever met any other Hatcher. The transfer had been complete since 2018. Our grandfather had not personally owned the farm at the moment of his death. Calvin's forge had disposed of an estate that, on the date Calvin's lawyer had drafted the forgery, had not legally existed for 6 years. Third, and this was the part where I had to set the document down on the chestnut floor and look at Ruth, and Ruth had to look back at me, and neither of us could speak for almost a full minute. The will granted to Ruth and to me, in equal undivided shares, the entirety of the mineral rights to the back ridge above Beaver Creek, the same mineral rights our grandfather had quietly held since 1962. The same mineral rights Calvin had been told, by the same forged document that gave him the farmhouse, were now his. They were not his. They had never been his. They had been transferred to the trust in 2009. They had been held in our names for the last 15 years. The third item in the box was a folder of correspondence, organized chronologically, with a small typed index on the inside front cover in our grandfather's exact careful style. Letters from a regional natural gas company, Cumberland Mountain Energy, headquartered in Knoxville, dating back to 2014. They had approached our grandfather 4 times over 10 years about leasing the back ridge for natural gas extraction. He had refused them every time. The most recent letter, dated July of the previous year, contained a formal offer with specific terms. A 15-year lease on the 87-acre back ridge. Signing bonus of $1,400,000. Royalty payments structured at 20% of net production revenue. The geological survey appended to the offer estimated recoverable natural gas reserves on the ridge at present value, over the lease term, of between $22 and $28 million in royalty income. Ruth made the small exhaling sound again. I felt my hand begin to shake on the page and put it down on the floor. The fourth item was a letter from our grandfather addressed to a man named Robert Pickering, the senior partner at Pickering, Mosley and Vance, with a copy attached for us. It was dated the week before he died. It instructed Pickering to wait exactly 30 days after our grandfather's death and the reading of any will Calvin produce before contacting Ruth and me directly. He had wanted, the letter explained, to give us a clean look at what Calvin would do if he believed he had won. He had wanted us to see it without interference. He had wanted us, particularly me, to understand for ourselves the full scale of what our family had been willing to do once the patriarch was no longer in the room. Eli has worked this farm for 38 years, our grandfather had written, and he has earned the right to know exactly who his cousins are before he decides what kind of life he wants to live alongside them. Ruth has tended to her brother and to me through every loss this family has had, and she has earned the right to the same knowledge. Let them see it clearly. Then send them to me in the mill, where I will have left everything they need to put right. The fifth item in the box was a small frame photograph I had never seen before. It was a black and white photograph from 1962, the year our grandfather had refused the first natural gas approach. It showed our grandfather, age 34, standing on the back ridge above Beaver Creek with his hand on the shoulder of a small boy in overalls, perhaps 4 years old. The boy was me. I had no memory of the photograph being taken. On the back of the frame, in our grandfather's writing, was a single line. I told him no for him. I sat on the floor of the mill for a long time after I read that line. Ruth sat with me. The light moved across the chestnut floor in slow gold inches, and the dust motes turned in the late afternoon air the way our grandfather had once described to me, and I understood, finally and completely, what he had meant when he told me, sometimes for the third time in a single week, that the floor of this mill was older than anything else on the property. He had not been talking about the wood. He had been talking about the choice. The choice his father Joseph had made in 1888 to lay this floor with chestnut from a ridge that the blight would erase from the world within 30 years, a wood that no one else in Tennessee had access to anymore, a wood that proved by its mere existence that the Hatcher family had been here long enough and worked this land carefully enough to hold something irreplaceable inside its own walls. The choice our grandfather had made in 1962 to refuse a natural gas company a child of 4 years old would never know about, because protecting that ridge mattered more than the money. The choice he had made in 2002 to write a real will and hide it in Nashville. The choice he had made in 2003 to begin transferring the farm into a trust no one in the family knew existed. The choice he had made 15 years later, when he was 93 years old and already dying slowly, to pry up a single board on the floor of his father's mill and prepare a hiding place for the documents that would correct, at the moment of his choosing, every injustice his nephew was going to attempt. The mill had not been a sentimental gift. The mill had been the safe. Ruth and I sat together on the chestnut floor for almost an hour. We didn't talk much. There was not much that needed saying yet. After a while, I closed the metal box, and I rewrapped in the oilcloth, and I set it carefully back into the cavity our grandfather had cut into the subfloor, because it occurred to me, sitting there in the falling light, that the safest place in Carter County for those documents was still exactly where our grandfather had put them. I refitted the chestnut board into its seam. I stood up. I helped Ruth stand up. We walked out of the mill together. I locked the heavy old Yale padlock behind us. I put the brass key back into my pocket beside the truck keys, where it had ridden for 46 years, and where it was going to ride for at least a little while longer. Then I drove Ruth back into Greenville, and we got 2 rooms at the small motel on Highway 11E, and we sat in Ruth's room with cups of coffee from the lobby machine, and we made one phone call. The number was on the letterhead of the first document in the box. Robert Pickering answered on the second ring. He had been expecting our call for 30 days. He told us, in a voice that was kind and unhurried and faintly relieved, that he had known our grandfather for 22 years, and that he was extraordinarily glad to finally meet the 2 of us, even by phone. He told us he could be in Greenville the following Monday. He told us to bring the box. If this story is moving you, hit the like button and turn on a bell so you never miss another story like this one. There are people listening tonight who recognize what Ruth and I were sitting with that evening, the long, exhausted, almost unbearable relief of finally understanding that the person who loved you most had spent decades believing in you and protecting you in a language no one else in your family had ever bothered to learn how to speak. Stay with us. The next part is the one that matters. Robert Pickering arrived in Greenville on the Monday following our discovery, exactly as he had promised. He was a tall, lean man in his late 60s, with the courtly, unhurried manner of a generation of Tennessee attorneys who had practiced a particular kind of country law for longer than most of his clients had been alive. He met us at the same Highway 11E motel, and we drove out to the farm together, in his car, a clean older Lincoln with cloth seats, because, as he explained on the drive, he had ridden in our grandfather's truck twice in the last 20 years, and he wanted, for sentimental reasons of his own, to approach the property the way our grandfather had brought him to it the first time. Pickering had been to the farm before, twice in 2002, 3 times in 2003, once a year, every year for the next 15 years. He had come for one annual review of the trust documents, conducted in our grandfather's kitchen over a pot of coffee roof, and I had never known he had made for any guest. He had been the only person outside our immediate family our grandfather had trusted with the truth of what he was doing. Your grandfather, Pickering said quietly as we turned onto the farm lane, was the most patient client I ever had. He understood from the beginning that we were not building an estate plan. We were building a piece of evidence. We drove past the farmhouse. Calvin's truck was in the driveway. I could see Marlene through the kitchen window, and the way her shoulders moved told me she was on the phone, and the way she was on the phone, leaning forward with her free hand pressed against the counter, told me she was talking to Travis. They had been busy in the 3 weeks since the lawyer's office. They had already begun moving things into the farmhouse, a new dining room set, visible through the front window, that hadn't been there at the funeral, boxes stacked on the porch, a surveyor's flag at the corner of the front pasture I didn't recognize. They had been planning a long time for the moment they thought had finally come. We drove past without slowing. Pickering watched the house go by with the calm professional interest of a man who had been preparing for this morning for 22 years. He told me about your cousin, Travis. He said, as we passed the equipment shed, in 2017, your grandfather came down to my office in Nashville with a folder of correspondence Travis had sent him about restructuring the family holdings. Your grandfather had read every page of it twice. He brought it to me to confirm what he already suspected, which was that Travis had been quietly building the legal infrastructure for a forced sale of the farm for 2 years. Travis had also, your grandfather wanted me to know, been speaking to a real estate developer out of Nashville about a residential subdivision on the bottom land. Your grandfather did not raise his voice when he told me this. He simply said, Robert, my brother's son is going to try to take my brother's father's farm. We are going to make absolutely certain he cannot. Pickering glanced at me. We did. We pulled up at the mill. I got out and unlocked the door with the brass key. Pickering watched me do it without saying anything. The way a man watches a ritual he had been waiting a long time to see. And we went inside, and I lifted the chestnut board, and we brought the box out into the autumn light, and laid everything on the lid of an old grain barrel my grandfather had set up as a work surface in the corner. Pickering went through every document with us slowly. He confirmed the validity of the 2002 will. He confirmed the structure and current status of the Hatcher Family Land Preservation Trust. He confirmed that Ruth and I were the sole beneficiaries, that the transfer had been complete and properly recorded since 2018, that the mineral rights had been in our names since 2009. He confirmed the standing offer from Cumberland Mountain Energy. He told us, gently and carefully, that the offer had increased twice since the most recent letter in the file, because Cumberland's geological survey had been updated in the spring with new horizontal fracturing technology that had nearly doubled the recoverable estimates. The current offer on the table was a $1,800,000 signing bonus and a 22% royalty structure. The present value of the lease over 15 years was now estimated at $31 to $36 million. Ruth sat down on the grain barrel. I leaned against the wall. There's one more thing, Pickering said, and reached into his briefcase and withdrew a final folder. Your grandfather instructed me to give this to you only after you had seen everything else. He wanted you to make this decision with full information. The folder contained a draft document our grandfather had prepared with Pickering's office in 2019, the year he had turned 91, the year the doctors had first told him his heart was beginning to fail. It was a proposal, not a will, not a trust amendment, a proposal addressed to Ruth and to me. It outlined, in our grandfather's precise, unhurried language, 3 options he wanted us to consider once we knew the truth. The first option was the simplest. We could accept the trust as it stood, sign the Cumberland Mountain Energy lease, take the signing bonus and the royalty income, and use it to purchase a clean, modest property of our own anywhere in the country. The farm, the full 420 acres, the farmhouse, everything, would remain in the trust under our control, and we could lease it out to another farming family on terms of our own choosing, or sell pieces of it as we saw fit. We would never have to speak to Calvin again. We would have wealth our cousins would never have access to. Our grandfather had structured the trust with a clean exit clause that specifically allowed for this outcome. He wanted us to know that he would not consider it a failure. He wanted us to know that the decision was entirely ours. The second option was harder. We could accept the trust as it stood, sign the lease, and confront Calvin directly with a forged will and the real will, and let the legal system do what the legal system would do. Forgery of a testamentary document is a felony in the state of Tennessee. Pickering's office had already retained, on our grandfather's instructions, the services of a forensic document examiner in Nashville who had been waiting for the call. The two witnesses Calvin had used could be identified, located, and interviewed under subpoena. Travis, as a licensed attorney who had almost certainly assisted in the drafting of the fraudulent document, faced disbarment in addition to criminal liability. Our grandfather had wanted us to understand, before we chose this path, that it would be long and public and ugly, and that it would split the family permanently and irreparably. He had also wanted us to understand that he would not blame us for choosing it. The third option was the one our grandfather had clearly hoped. With the quiet humility of a man who had loved his nephew's children imperfectly, but loved them nonetheless. That we would consider. The third option was restoration, not of the family. He had stopped believing in the possibility of that restoration sometime in the late 1990s, when Calvin had stopped returning his calls. The restoration of the land. Under this option, Ruth and I would accept the trust, sign the Cumberland Mountain Energy lease, and use the signing bonus and the first 3 years of royalty income to do 4 specific things. We would establish a legally protected agricultural easement on the front 300 acres of bottomland, ensuring that the soil our great-grandfather Joseph had broken for the first time in 1887 could never be subdivided into a residential development under any future ownership. We would restore the grist mill, the actual mill, the wheel, the burrs, the dustlit second floor with its slatted windows, as a working educational facility for small-scale grain milling, open to public and free to school groups within a 50-mile radius. We would establish a scholarship in our grandmother's name at the Agricultural College in Knoxville for first-generation farming students from Carter and Greene counties, and we would offer Calvin, his wife, and his 3 sons a single, structured, non-negotiable settlement. They would receive the farmhouse outright, the building, the contents Marlene had taken, the half-acre it sat on, in exchange for a notarized acknowledgement of the legitimate trust and a signed agreement to vacate the remaining property within 90 days. No criminal complaint would be filed. No civil suit would be pursued. No reference to the forge would ever appear in any public record. Calvin and his family would walk away with an 1887 farmhouse on a half-acre, valued at perhaps $240,000, and they would walk away with their reputations and their professional licenses intact. In exchange, we would receive the 420 acres, the mineral lease, the equipment, the cattle, and the legal certainty that our grandfather's land would remain working farmland for the rest of our lifetimes and beyond. Our grandfather had written, at the end of the third option, a final paragraph in his careful, slow hand. I am not asking you to forgive Calvin. I am not asking you to embrace him. I am asking you to consider whether the kind of victory that requires destroying a family is the kind of victory a hatcher should want. Your great-grandfather Joseph laid the floor of that mill in the winter of 1888 with chestnut from a ridge that no one will ever see chestnut grow on again. He laid that floor for people who were not yet born. I am asking you, my last grandchildren, to do the same thing, to choose, if you can, the option that protects what cannot be replaced, and lets go of what can. I will love whatever you decide. I have already loved whatever you decide. Ruth and I read the third option together. We read it twice. Then we sat in the cold afternoon light on the chestnut floor of our great-grandfather's mill, and we did not say anything for a long time, and Pickering, who had clearly been instructed by our grandfather in advance on exactly this moment, quietly excused himself and stepped outside to sit on the limestone foundation wall and look at the creek. When Ruth finally spoke, her voice was very soft. He spent the last 22 years of his life, she said, making sure that we would have a choice he never had. I nodded. Eli, she said, I know which one I want. I know which one I want too, I said. We chose the third option. We held a meeting in the farmhouse kitchen 10 days later, on a Wednesday morning in early November, because Ruth and I had decided together that whatever conversation we were about to have with Calvin and his family needed to happen in a room our grandmother had cooked Sunday dinner in for 58 years. Pickering had arranged a meeting through a single carefully worded letter to Calvin's attorney, requesting a family conference to discuss certain irregularities in the recently probated estate of Hollis Joseph Hatcher. Calvin's attorney, a Greenville man named Doss who had handled real estate closings for our family for 30 years and who, Pickering had quietly determined, had no involvement whatsoever in the forgery, had advised Calvin to attend without bringing him. Doss had read the room correctly. He had told Calvin, On a phone call, Pickering's investigator had not been able to obtain a transcript of, but had been able to verify the existence and length of that something had come up that Doss could not advise on without more information, and that Calvin should attend the meeting prepared to listen carefully. Calvin came at 10 o'clock in the morning, with Marlene, with Travis, with Brent, with Cody. They brought their own coffee and travel mugs because Marlene had apparently decided that accepting hospitality from Ruth and me at the farmhouse Marlene had spent 3 weeks beginning to redecorate was beneath her current understanding of the situation. They walked into the kitchen with the practiced grievance of a family that had already decided we were the problem. Travis, at 41, had developed in the last decade his father's particular way of entering a room. Chin slightly raised, eyes unhurried, body language designed to communicate that whatever was about to happen was happening at his discretion. Ruth and I were already seated at the kitchen table when they came in. Pickering sat to my right. The metal lockbox sat in the center of the table. The chestnut board our grandfather had pried up in his 95th year sat on top of the lockbox. The folded photograph of our grandfather and 4-year-old me on the back ridge sat in front of the chestnut board, propped against the box, so that whoever entered the room saw it first. Calvin saw it first. I watched him see it. I watched him not understand it. I watched Travis behind him see it second and not understand it either. Marlene took the chair at the far end of the table and arranged her coat across her lap with the efficient irritation of a woman who had decided that whatever this meeting was about, it was going to make her late for something. Brent and Cody stood behind their parents because there were not enough chairs. Travis remained standing, too, by the door, with the calm professional alertness of an attorney who had begun, somewhere in the last 15 seconds, to suspect that the morning was not going to go the way his family had planned. Calvin, Pickering said quietly, "Thank you for coming. My name is Robert Pickering. I am an attorney with Pickering, Mosley & Vance in Nashville. I was your Uncle Hollis's estate attorney for the last 22 years of his life. I am here this morning at the instruction of his real last will and testament, executed in my office on August 19th, 2002, and held in trust by my firm continuously since that date. I am also here as the legal counsel of record for the Hatcher Family Land Preservation Trust, formed in 2003, and the legal counsel of record for the Trust's 2 beneficiaries, Eli Hatcher and Ruth Hatcher-Maddox, who you see seated across from you at this table. Mr. Hatcher and Ms. Maddox have asked me to deliver some information to you this morning. Then they have asked me to deliver an offer. I will ask you to listen to both before responding." Calvin's face had begun to change. Not all at once. The change moved through it in slow, careful stages, the way water moves into dry ground. The wide, assured set of his mouth tightened first. Then his eyes pulled inward. Then his shoulders, which he had been carrying high in the practiced way of a man who fills rooms, came down half an inch and stayed there. Marlene had begun looking at him sideways. Travis, by the door, had gone perfectly still. Pickering opened the box. He laid the documents on the table in the order our grandfather had specified. He explained the 2002 will. He explained the trust formation in 2003 and the 15-year transfer schedule. He explained that the farm, the 420 acres, the farmhouse, the equipment, the mineral rights, had not been part of our grandfather's personal estate at the moment of his death, and had therefore not been available for disposal under any will, real or otherwise, that purported to dispose of his personal estate. He explained the standing offer from Cumberland Mountain Energy and the current valuation of the mineral lease. He explained with quiet, careful precision, and without raising his voice once, that what Calvin had produced in the lawyer's office 3 weeks earlier was a forgery. He explained that the 2 witnesses on it had been identified and interviewed. He explained that the forensic document examiner who had reviewed the document at our grandfather's prepaid retainer had confirmed the signature was not authentic. He explained the criminal exposure in the state of Tennessee of every adult in the room who had participated in the drafting, witnessing, executing, or filing of that document. Travis sat down. He did not pull out a chair to sit down. He simply lowered himself onto the small wooden bench by the kitchen door, the bench our grandmother had used for 60 years to sit and put on her gardening shoes, and stayed there with his hands flat on his knees and his eyes on the kitchen floor. Calvin had not moved. His coffee was cooling in his hand. His mouth had opened slightly. He was looking at Pickering, but I could see, with a clarity I had not had in the lawyer's office 3 weeks earlier, that he was not actually seeing Pickering. He was seeing, behind his eyes, the long, careful structure of the last 30 years of his relationship with his uncle, every dismissive comment about the farm, every missed phone call, every Christmas he had not visited, every funeral he had only attended because optics required it. And he was beginning to understand that his uncle had seen all of it, had recorded all of it in a way that mattered, and had spent the last 2 decades quietly building the precise legal machinery that would make. Every one of those choices count against him at the moment of his greatest expected triumph. Pickering finished. He folded his hands on the table. He looked at me. I had thought a great deal in the last 10 days about what I wanted to say in this moment. I had drafted it 3 times in my head while I fed the cattle. I had revised it twice while I walked the back ridge in the cold November mornings. But sitting there at the kitchen table with my cousin's face in front of me, Travis with his hands on his knees, Cody behind her with the wide, stunned eyes of a 28-year-old who had clearly never been told the full extent of what his father and brother had been planning, I found that the speech I had drafted was not the speech I wanted to give. I cleared my throat. "Calvin," I said, "Granddad knew." He looked at me. "He knew," I said, "for 30 years. He didn't put any of this in motion to punish you. He put it in motion because he loved this farm more than he was willing to lose it, and he understood that you were going to try to take it. He gave you 22 years to choose differently. You didn't. So he prepared a way for the land to outlast all of us, no matter what you did. And now we're sitting here, and Ruth and I have a choice to make about what happens to you." I let that sit for a moment. I watched Calvin's hand begin to shake on the coffee cup. I watched Marlene reach over, very quietly, and take the cup from him before it spilled. "Granddad wrote out 3 options," I said. "Ruth and I have read them. We've talked about them. We've made our decision. Before I tell you what it is, I need you to understand the 2 we didn't choose." I told him about the option to walk away clean and leave him in possession of a farm he didn't legally own, and about why we hadn't chosen it. I told him about the option to file the criminal complaint, pursue Travis's disbarment, take everything publicly through the courts in a process that would last 3 years, and end his family's name in this county. I told him we had not chosen that one either. I told him our grandfather had asked us, in his last letter, to consider whether destroying a family was a kind of victory a hatcher should want. I told him about option 3. I watched Marlene begin to cry. Not loudly, not performatively, just slow, steady tears running down her face into her coat collar. I watched Travis, on the bench, drop his face into his hands. I watched Cody, 28 years old, who had spent his whole life in a family that had taught him Ruth, and I were the embarrassing background of his existence, look at me as though he was meeting me for the first time. I watched Calvin's face break. It did not break the way I had expected it to break. It did not break with anger or denial or the flushed defensive rage I had been bracing for. It broke quietly. The careful arrangement of his features simply gave way, the way a structure gives way when its load-bearing wall has been removed, and underneath the arrangement was a 66-year-old man whose father had died when Calvin was 9, who had spent his whole life trying to prove to a long-dead father that he was as substantial as his Uncle Hollis, and who had just been shown, in his uncle's own kitchen, that he had not been substantial enough to even be left in the dark properly. He had been left in the dark on purpose. He had been left in the dark for 22 years. He had been left in the dark because his uncle, who he had spent his life resenting for the easy, steady belonging to the land that Calvin had never managed to feel, had never trusted him. And the worst part, the part one could see hitting him as he sat there with Marlene's hand on his arm, was that his uncle had been right not to. He spoke for the first time. His voice was not the voice he had used in the lawyer's office. "Eli," he said, "I'm sorry. I did not respond immediately. I had not expected an apology. I had expected resistance, defensiveness, an attorney's request for a delay, so that Travis could review documents. I had not expected, sitting across from a man who had spent his life being unable to acknowledge me as a peer, an unconditional apology in the first sentence. Travis spoke from the bench. "I drafted it," he said. He was looking at the kitchen floor. "I drafted the will. I found the witnesses. I told Dad it would work. He didn't know. He didn't know about the trust. None of us knew about the trust, but he did know we were drafting a substitute will. He knew that. I'm not going to pretend he didn't. But the rest of it was me. He raised his head and looked at Pickering. I'll surrender my license. I'll do it voluntarily. You don't have to file. I'll do it this week. Pickering looked at me. The decision was mine. I thought about it. I thought about Travis at 12 years old. Thank you for staying with us all the way to the end. Don't forget to subscribe and check out the other stories on screen right now.